how'd you get started in this business anyway?
Well, I've always been interested in electricity. My mom tells me that when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I used to take a bread knife and go plug it into the wall. And for some reason, I survived, not knowing any better. But my father was a ham radio operator back in the 20s in California. And when I was, I don't know, 12 or 13, he bought me a crystal set kit, which I put together, and I could stay in bed at night with my headphones, and we had a big long wire antenna running out to a tree. And that's where I picked up on jazz. There were 2 or 3 stations that had evening jazz shows. One of them was Felix Grant on WMAL, and he was on for about 3 hours every night. And the other guy was Willis Conover, who was a big jazz guy with the Voice of America. He would have been about 51, 52. I would have been 13 years old in 1951. He might have given it to me sooner. I can't remember, but at any event, that got me hooked on electronics. And then I got a ham license, which I stupidly let expire a few years ago. I haven't been on the air in a long time, but it was fun because back then you could get government surplus Second World War radios and soup them up, and you could put out like 100 watts and 75 meters and talk just about anywhere on the planet. And my big problem is I never had a really good receiver, but anyway, I went through that whole routine, and audio had become probably the best way to describe it was an obsession. And I remember I did a science fair project in 1956 on stereo. Nobody had a clue, and I had a turntable, and back then Cook Records was selling these binaural LPs. There's a couple of them in that stack over there, right? 2 parallel tracks. One's left channel, one's right channel. So you had a pickup arm with a sidecar with a second cartridge in it. And when you dropped the arm, the trick was to hit the same corresponding place in both grooves, which was anyway, I had that. I had a 1/4-inch 2-track play-only Viking tape machine with some pre-recorded 2-tracks that I just dug out of the archives here not too long ago. And I had some kind of a radio in there, but at that point, stereo radio hadn't come along. Anyway, nobody knew what this was, but I was totally hooked. I remember when I first heard stereo, it was off 1/4-inch tape at a hi-fi store down in Washington. And about 1958 is when the stereo LP came along. And my little funky home hi-fi was like 15 watts and a corner horn. And I remember hooking up some amplifier that I got my hands on and another completely different speaker. And I bought a GE stereo phono pickup cartridge, and I forget what I did for a preamp. Maybe both of those amplifiers had it in. Anyway, I'm sitting there going, holy cow, stereo record scratch. It blew my mind completely. And so if I hadn't been hooked by then, that was one of the nails in the case, whatever. And I worked my way through school rebuilding surplus Ampex machines you could go down to the Navy Yard surplus depot and buy a forklift skid with a box on the top full of Ampex transports for $50. I remember it cost one load we had to rent a truck, and the truck rental was more than the $50. And some of them had electronics and some of them didn't. So all the ones that were rebuildable as complete machines, I sold. And I also had a deal with a couple of agencies that were they had first call on surplus, and the stuff that we got at the Navy Yard was the dregs, which is fine. And so they would give me 2 machines that were complete but needed a complete overhaul. And we redo the transports down to having the hardware replated. That's how far we went with it. Recap the electronics. We give them one back working, keep the other one, fix it up, and sell it. And I did several hundred of those machines over about a 5-year period before my crazy little company got started. And it was called SSI. And it got started with some very bad concepts, including the name. Believe it or not, it was Suburban Sound, which is the stupidest name I ever heard of. And we didn't really know what we were doing. But one of the partners, investors, was a sound contractor, and so he was sending me all this work that had to be done for cheap, and it almost never got paid. And it took me about a year and a half to figure out that that wasn't going to get it, and I hadn't taken a salary at that point. And so we got into rebuilding Ampexes big time. And we took 300s, which was a 10-inch rack mount machine, and we would make new metal work and kick the reel holes out to where they would take 14-inch reels, and we kicked the speed up to 60 hips, and we were making tape duplicators. And we cloned the Ampex electronics, and I did a bunch of that stuff, and I had some people working for me at that point. And then we got into the console business, and I built the first two big ones the first one I built of any significance was for the Eastman School of Music, and that was a 4-bus, 16-in, very primitive console, again, all, I forget whether it was API op amps or Melcore, probably Melcore back then, same general little square block with 7 pins on it. And then I built the two biggies for Phil Ramone, and they were discrete transformer in, transformer out amplifier modules that sat in a rack, so there was about a half a rack full of them. It was 40 in, and it was a 12-bus console because they were convinced the 12-track was going to be it. Well, they didn't even have the first console, and they had to have 16 in order to sell a room. And this was a tracking room. It wasn't a room where you would mix down, because the bean counter said, all right, you got this great big expensive studio out there at X number of bucks per square foot, and you can only sell it 24 hours a day. So the console didn't have any pan pots. And they had these mix rooms offsite that would simultaneously do a mono and a stereo. And they had 13 EMTs, stereo EMTs, mounted on inverted railroad tracks on the ceiling in the basement of this building. They were up on the 8th floor or something. And all the EMTs came up to a room, and when you booked a gig, they were all tuned to, some were brass and some were woodwinds and some were strings and some were vocals. You would book the echo chambers that you wanted to use for the gig that you were doing, whether it was tracking or mixing down later on. And so they had this big patch bay. And anyway, these consoles had two 12-input, 8-bus premixes. And then the main part of the console was 16 in, so there was a total of 40 in altogether on this thing. And lots of sends. No built-in EQ. It was all in the rack, and the rack was a 4-bay, 6-foot rack off to the side. I got a picture of it around here somewhere. And everything was patchable. Anyway, we built two of them. Probably lost money on both of them, but it was one hell of a good experience, and that got me introduced to Val Valentine. It got me introduced to Phil. I'd already known Phil. And I made all kinds of contacts as a result of that work, which didn't hurt a bit. So then in 1974, when MCI came out with the cheap 16-track and the cheap console, that was the end of the custom console business, and we folded, I think, in April of 74. We basically, I got a friend of mine to pay off the back taxes, and I walked away. And then I helped him liquidate all the stuff, and he about quadrupled his money over 2 years, which was sad. But I had a real killer of a machine shop, which is now in some way somebody's factory in Maine, from what I understand. There were a whole lot of mistakes made, and I took 2 years of business administration and economics in school. And the only thing about running a small business that they didn't bother to beat your head in with was the fact that you have to have a positive cash flow. And if you don't have a positive cash flow, you're screwed. And we didn't. And I mean, I know I was up to 17 employees at one point, and the most frightening thing was figuring out how to make the payroll every week. And anyway, it got to the point where I had to lay off about half the people, and the rest of them hung around for a while. And then when the MCI came out, we just folded it. MCI was Music Center Inc. It was a hi-fi store down in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, actually, I think it was. I met Jeep through a client of mine in Washington, and he got into NASA surplus. And at that point, NASA had bought hundreds of Ampex machines, and they were starting to show up surplus. So he would fix up the transports, and for a while he was selling vacuum tube electronics, just rebuilt Ampex. But then, when the 440 came out, he literally cloned it to the point where the parts are interchangeable. And Ampex never did anything about it. So he was selling 300 transports with cloned 440 electronics, and that was what got MCI off the ground. And then he was apparently pretty wealthy to start with. They got into making the famous machines that we all know about.